Did you know that what country you target with your social media marketing agency offer makes a huge difference? In fact, it actually makes a bigger difference often than your actual offer or even your actual industry you're targeting. So understanding which countries are more or less competitive can be a huge advantage in growing faster and having less struggles. Now, I'm Michael, and for the last 10 years, I've been building marketing agencies, and I've had the opportunity to manage cold email prospecting campaigns for well over 100. Now, because of this, I've had the opportunity to target dozens of countries. So I have a lot of insights into where is competitive, where is not competitive, and where you may want to consider running your next outreach campaign to. So in this video, I'm going to break through how I think about what countries to target, some recommendations, some to avoid, and everything you'll want to know about what countries to target and not to target. Let's go ahead and get into the video. I have put together this worksheet here as well as a spreadsheet listing different countries that are going to help a lot throughout this video. So if you do want to download these resources, there will be a link in the description to do so. So what is the goal of this video? It's to decide what country makes the most sense for you to target when selling your services. Now, the core principle behind this is that saturation is not only on a niche level, but also on a country level. Let's take chiropractors. Chiropractors are a traditionally saturated niche, along with real estate, dentists, and a whole bunch of others. But just because they're saturated in the United States, maybe the United Kingdom, doesn't mean that they're saturated in Singapore or South Africa or New Zealand. Because at the end of the day, saturation is just a result of a lot of people going into a niche. Now, one consideration too is that a lot of times things come saturated because they're good. Now, that doesn't mean you just want to go for the least competitive thing, because often the least competitive thing is the least competitive because there's no money to be made. You know, a funny example here, but why don't a lot of people do cold email in Tuvalu? Well, because there's like 20 businesses, right? So it's not always a good idea to do the least competitive thing, but sometimes we can find campaigns where it's not that competitive and it's really profitable. So that's what we want to explore further today. Let's talk about the general level of competition for most core countries as well as regions. Now, I have to add a disclaimer. This is based on my experience and this will vary. I also don't have campaign data on every single country. Realistically, I've probably sent cold emails to about 75 to 100 countries, but in terms of ones I've sent enough cold emails I have data, it's probably closer to 30. So I'm going to put some core countries here that I get asked a lot about, and also for ones I don't get asked a lot about or I don't think are very valuable, I'm just going to group them into regions. So this is not my personal preferences, it's just where I get asked about. Now I'm going to rank these from 1 to 4, with 4 being the most competitive and 1 being the least competitive generally. So let's start with the tier 4 countries. Now, the most competitive country, even if in tier 4, by a healthy margin, is going to be the United States. And this is a good reason. Salaries are really high. People have a lot of spending power. They're pretty easy to work with. Sales cycles are pretty fast. It's a great country to work in. In my opinion, it's probably the best. Now, that also means it's the most competitive. You have people in the US, in Canada, in Mexico, in India, in Pakistan, Bangladesh, Philippines, and literally every other place that want to work with people from the US. The US is one of those countries where it's not just Americans targeting Americans, it's Americans and pretty much the rest of the entire world. That is why it's competitive. Does that mean you shouldn't target there? No, it just means it's competitive. Now, some other countries that are competitive, although not as quite as the US, would be Canada, UK, and Australia. In my experience, these are the 4 most competitive countries. Now, moving down to tier 3, we have Western Europe. I've kind of grouped it together. Now, obviously, some countries are more or less competitive. Random example, Germany's pretty competitive, but it's a great market. And also New Zealand. I would say New Zealand's a bit easier than Australia, just because there's a little bit lower spending power in New Zealand than there is in Australia. Now, below this, we have tier 2. I've kind of generally grouped together Eastern Europe here. Now, I probably should add Western Europe. I'm also talking about like Southern Europe and Scandinavia. I probably should have listed that, but whatever. Tier 2, we have Eastern Europe. Now, Eastern Europe is actually a pretty good target for a lot of people because they have a lot of great tech companies or companies that work with US based companies and have higher spending power. So I do actually run campaigns there myself, but it's generally less competitive. Following Eastern Europe, we have South Africa, Singapore. Singapore is a market I love. It's not very big, but super high spending power. People are easy to work with. English business operating language. It's really great. We also have Israel, Mexico, China, most of South America, and the Gulf countries. I'm basing this on GCC member countries, which would be the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Oman. Now, it's worth noting that specifically in UAE, but also a good bit in these other countries, you have a lot of businesses that are registered and located here, but they're operated by Europeans or Americans. For example, in the UAE, even if you run campaigns there, you're probably not going to work with many Emiratis. You'll probably be working with a lot of Brits, Germans, and Americans, to be honest. So that's one consideration. Now, for Tier 1, the easiest countries, we have most of Central America, the Caribbean, Oceania, most of Africa, and the rest of Asia pretty much. And again, that is my classification based on my experience, but also considering I don't have experience in every one of these countries. So that gives you a bit of a peek into what the competition does look like, but we're going to talk a bit later on this document how you can actually utilize this. So 2 notes here. For the most part, there is a direct correlation between a country's spending power and its level of competition, because generally saturation means money, and a country's use of English as a primary language or business language, such as Qatar, UAE, business language meaning what language they operate businesses in, and its level of competition. Now, this just makes sense. Most money is in English-speaking countries, and also most other countries learn English, meaning they can also sell to people who speak English. So it makes sense. Now, to further break this down, I've actually compiled a spreadsheet, which will be available for download too in the same link below, of all of the UN member countries. So this is not my definition of what a country is, it is the UN member definition, which means there's actually some more. And I've also included their average income for citizens based on ChatGPT, not perfect, and the languages spoken, again, based on ChatGPT. So let's look at that really quick, just so you can check it out. Okay, so here we have it, all of the UN member countries, as well as the average income monthly per person, and the language spoken based on GPT data. If we sort here from high to low on income, we can get that these are probably the most competitive countries because they have a very high spending power. Now take the ones with a high spending power that also speak English, and we have the most competitive countries generally. So again, this will be available for download if you want to use this to figure out where do they speak French and have a high spending power, or Spanish and have a high spending power, or if you just want to look at it just to get some ideas, it will be available in the description. Now, you may be asking, what can we do with this data? How do you decide what country you should be selling to? Well, let's go through the considerations that I would personally reflect on. Now, there's 6 things I generally evaluate a country on. And the first one is, does the country speak a language I'm fluent in, either as a primary business or business operating language? If you don't speak the language, or if you don't speak it fluently, it's going to be really hard. Now, countries not operating in English are going to be less competitive, but again, that's because countries that speak English generally have high spending power, and most countries learn English, meaning they can target English-speaking countries. So that is the first consideration. The second one is, does this country have a culture I want to work with? There are going to be some countries that have good spending power and meet other considerations, but they have a work culture that you might find frustrating. For example, I love Japan. It is my second favorite country, but I would not want to work with Japanese businesses. The work culture there is not something that I would do well in. I would probably fail. So that is a pretty important consideration. Now, the next one we have here is, can this country afford my services? If a country can't afford your services, you can pretty much remove it from your list. That's a pretty easy one. So look at what spending power is like there, and it can be pretty easy to either check it or remove it from your list. Now, next is the total addressable market, meaning the total amount of people that I want to sell to that exist in a country, large enough. If you're targeting dentists, but your country only has 100 dentists, it's probably not worth your effort. Now, would I take these 100 dentists and throw them in a larger campaign? Yes, but I won't build your business around it. Now, you can always target multiple countries, so that's one consideration. Maybe if you have 5 small countries or 1 big country, or both, up to you. Now, next consideration is, are there enough individuals or companies in my target country for my clients to work with? If you work with dentists, but you're targeting a tiny city where there's only 10,000 people, Facebook ads are only going to work for so long. So can your client's total addressable market be enough to sustain 6 months of your services? That's how I like to think about it. Now, another thing is, when it comes time to hire, can you find affordable talent in a language you're operating in? If you're operating in Spanish, well, it's pretty easy to hire affordable, talented leader in Spanish because you have Mexico, you have all of Central America, most of South America, so it's not that bad. However, if you are in Germany, it's going to be harder to find somebody who's affordable and talented that's fluent in German. Now, another consideration is for pretty much everybody. It's always easier to get clients that are physically near you, driving distance. This is how most people, especially older generations, choose who to work with. They work with who's near them. So if you can leverage that because you want to work with people near you, certainly do that. And then one step further, it's always going to be a little bit easier to work with people in your country because there is that trust factor there. So that's the last consideration I have. So the final part of this video is, what do you do with this information? So I'm going to give you 3 paths based on different situations that you can take and then go figure out what your game plan is with these. Now, the first one is, what if you're in a country with pretty much no spending power and you don't want to work in it? Well, I would choose a country or a few with English as the primary language, and I would target there. That's pretty simple. Now, what if you're in a country that you do want to operate in, but it's not an English-speaking country? Well, I would get your first 3 to 5 clients there, and I would do all the fulfillment yourself so you don't need to hire in that language. Use them as case studies because it's going to be easier to get them meetings and probably easier to get them results. Then I would use those clients' case studies to break into the US market, which will make it easier to get those first clients in the US market, also factoring that you're international. And then you'll also be able to tap into a bigger hiring pool because you'll be operating in English when it comes to that time. Now, the final thing I'd say here is, if you're in a country that you want to operate in and it's an English-speaking country and has a big total addressable market, US, Canada, UK, US, I would start within your city, leverage that trust, get a few case studies, and then go nationwide. So that is what I would do depending on your country and situation. Now, I don't see a lot of people talking about this, and I think honestly the reason is it's not great for the YouTube algorithm, but at the end of the day, I want to help people, and I think this will help people. So if this was helpful, I'd really appreciate it if you gave it a like and subscribe, and if you do want help building out your B2B business, your offer, your outbound, your sales process and fulfillment, go ahead and book a call with me at b2boutbound.io, where we can work together to set up your agency in a way that gives you the lifestyle you want. So link below, and I hope to see you there.